The bank statement sat on the conference table between us like a body nobody wanted to claim. I didn't reach for it right away. I let it sit there, this single sheet of paper, while my husband's lawyer kept talking about his client's limited liquidity and good faith financial hardship. I watched Mark's face instead. I watched the exact second his eyes dropped to that statement and the blood left his cheeks like someone had pulled a plug. $2,531,000. That was the number sitting in an account he swore, under oath, did not exist. My lawyer hadn't even said anything yet. She just slid it across the table, calm as setting down a coffee cup, and let the silence do the talking. 15 years of marriage. 5 years of him telling me we were drowning. 5 years of me emptying my own inheritance into a company he said was barely keeping the lights on. I used to believe him so completely that I apologized for buying name-brand cereal. Mark opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That's not," he started. "It's dated last Tuesday," my lawyer said pleasantly. "Would you like to try again?" I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment. I didn't. I felt the particular stillness that comes after you've been holding your breath for so long you forgot air was supposed to move. I felt 15 years of my life rearrange themselves in front of me, click by click, like a slot machine landing on the truth. But to understand how we got to that conference room, you have to go back. You have to go back to the beginning, when I still thought for richer or poorer was a promise instead of a sentence I'd serve. My name is Claire Whitfield. This is the story of how a $14 subscription fee ended a marriage built on a lie so large it needed an offshore account just to breathe. I met Mark Delacroix when I was 26 years old, waiting tables at a wine bar in Charleston that I will not name because I still feel strangely loyal to it, the way you stay loyal to the scene of something that hasn't happened yet. He came in alone on a Tuesday, ordered a glass of Cabernet he clearly didn't know how to pronounce, and asked me so many questions about the menu that I started to think he was either painfully shy or building up the nerve to ask me something else. It turned out to be both. "I'm starting a company," he told me on our third date, with the particular brightness of a man who has never once doubted himself and doesn't understand that other people do. "Software, logistics optimization. It's going to be huge, Claire. I can feel it." I liked that about him in the beginning. I'd grown up watching my father work the same accounting job for 31 years, methodical and risk-averse and quietly miserable, and Mark's certainty felt like sunlight after a long winter. He talked about the future like it was already his, and being near him made me feel like maybe it could be mine too. We married 18 months later in my grandmother's backyard in Beaufort, under a oak tree my great-grandfather had planted. My grandmother, Alina, walked me down the makeshift aisle herself, since my father had passed 2 years earlier, and I remember she held my arm so tight it almost hurt. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, right before we stepped out, not unkindly, just honestly the way she said most things. "I loves him, Grandma Alina." "I know you do, baby. That's not what I asked." I didn't understand what she meant then. I understood it 15 years later, in a conference room, looking at a bank statement. The first few years were genuinely good. Mark's startup, a logistics platform called Rootwise, was small but scrappy, and I worked as a marketing coordinator for a regional hospital system while he built it out of a converted garage with 2 other guys from his MBA program. We didn't have much money, but we had the kind of poverty that feels like an adventure when you're young and in love and certain it's temporary. I remember those years with a softness I'm careful not to let bleed into the rest of the story because they were real. The version of Mark from those years was not a lie. He used to leave notes in my lunch bag. He actually cried, the day his first investor said yes. He used to say, "We built this together, Claire," and he meant it back then. It's important you understand that, because it's what made everything after so much harder to see. The turn happened so gradually that if you asked me to point to the exact day it started, I couldn't. That's the nature of a slow betrayal. It doesn't arrive. It seeps. Around year 8 of our marriage, Rootwise picked up real momentum. A mid-size logistics conglomerate started using their software for regional freight routing, and suddenly Mark wasn't coming home for dinner anymore. He was coming home at 10, 11, sometimes midnight, smelling like a stranger's office and someone else's coffee. "We're so close, Claire," he'd say, peeling off his blazer at the kitchen table while I reheated a plate I'd made hours earlier. "If we can just get through this next funding round." I believed him because I had no reason not to. I'd watched him build this thing from nothing, watched the calluses on his hands from years of nervous energy, watched him age and fast forward the way founders do. Why would I doubt the cost of something I'd seen him pay for with my own eyes? My grandmother, Alina, died the year I turned 36, and she left me something I hadn't expected. A modest but meaningful inheritance, just under $400,000, the accumulation of a long, careful, frugal life. She'd been a school teacher for 30 years and had quietly invested every spare dollar since 1974. In her will, there was a note. My lawyer would later find a copy of it in a box I'd forgotten I still had. For Claire to be hers alone in her name alone for whatever life requires of her. Not her husband's, hers. Love, Grandma E. At the time, I thought that phrasing was just my grandmother being her usual particular self. She'd never fully warmed to Mark, in the polite, careful way of a woman who decided not to make a fuss about something she couldn't change. I told myself it was an old woman's habit of caution, nothing more. I didn't listen to her, not really. Within 14 months of receiving that inheritance, I had put nearly $300,000 of it into Rootwise. It started small. Bridge funding, Mark called it, the first time he asked. Just until the Series B closes, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't temporary, Claire, you know that. I did know that, or I thought I did. Then it was $60,000 for payroll coverage, because 2 investors had pulled out unexpectedly. Then it was $40,000 because the lease on the new office space had balloon clauses nobody warned us about. Then it was small, recurring transfers, $2,000 and $3,000 at a time, slipping out of our joint account like water through a cracked pipe, always for some reason that sounded urgent and temporary and always solvable with just a little more time. I stopped buying new clothes. I started clipping coupons again, the way my father had taught me as a kid, except now it wasn't frugality, it was fear. I picked up freelance marketing work on the side, nights and weekends, money I funneled quietly into our shared accounts to help cover the gap between what we had and what we needed. I told myself I was investing in our future. I told myself this was what partnership looked like. Mark, meanwhile, started missing things. Our son Eli's 8th birthday party. He showed up 40 minutes late, tie loosened, apologizing to a room full of 8-year-olds about a server migration none of them understood or cared about. Our 10th wedding anniversary, which he remembered at 9 p.m. with a bouquet of grocery store flowers and the phrase, "The next 6 months are going to be insane. But after that, I promise." There was always an after that. After that, things would slow down. After that, we'd take the trip to Portugal we kept talking about. After that, he'd start coaching Eli's little league team like he used to promise. After that never came, but I kept waiting for it because the alternative, that there was no after that this was simply who he had decided to be, felt unbearable. It's a particular kind of psychological architecture, believing a lie. You don't just believe the lie itself. You build a whole structure of justifications around it, load-bearing walls made of your own hope, and eventually you can't tell which parts of the house are real and which parts you constructed just to keep standing. Looking back now, with the clarity that only comes after the chandelier falls, I can see the cracks were everywhere. I just didn't know how to read them yet. There was the time. Around year 11, when I picked up his phone to check the time and saw a calendar notification, mailbox renewal, Heritage Private Suites. I asked him about it, and he said without missing a beat, "Oh, that's just a PO box for Rootwise mail, keeps it separate from the house. You know how investors are about due diligence addresses." It sounded plausible. Everything Mark said always sounded plausible. That was, I would come to understand, his particular skill. There was the time our accountant, a kind older man named Pete Sorensen who'd done our taxes for a decade, gently mentioned that Mark's W-2 income from Rootwise had technically gone to zero 3 years earlier, replaced with what Mark called deferred founder equity, standard for companies in our growth stage. Pete raised an eyebrow but didn't push, because Pete was being paid by us, and because, frankly, neither of us wanted to be the one to pull that thread. There was the trip Mark took to the Cayman Islands, 4 years before the divorce, which he described as a logistics conference. Incredibly boring, I promise, mostly just supply chain panels and bad hotel coffee. I remember packing his suitcase for him that trip, because he was so swamped at the office that week, and I remember thinking it was strange that a man attending boring supply chain panels packed 2 linen blazers and a pair of $600 sunglasses I didn't recognize. I didn't ask. I told myself it was a gift to himself, a small reward for how hard he was working. I had become, by then, extremely skilled at not asking. There was the way he started flinching, almost imperceptibly, whenever I mentioned wanting to look at our joint statements together, something we used to do every month at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and a calculator back in the early years. "I've got it handled, Claire," he'd say, gently but firmly, the kind of firm that doesn't invite a follow-up question. "You've got enough on your plate with Eli and the freelance stuff. Let me carry this one." I let him carry it. For 3 more years, I let him carry it, and I told myself that was love, that was trust, that was partnership, when really it was simply the absence of information, dressed up in the language of care. The final crack, the one that should have been a fault line, came 18 months before everything broke open, on a rainy Thursday in October. Eli, who was 16 by then, came home from a friend's house and mentioned, completely offhand, while pouring himself cereal, that his friend's dad, a real estate agent named Greg Halloran, had mentioned seeing Mark's car at a luxury condo development downtown. "Like, a few times, I guess. Greg said your dad must be doing some kind of business thing there." "Probably a client meeting," I said, because by then I had a reflex for explaining away anything that didn't fit. I had built, over 15 years, an entire muscle memory for protecting a story that was no longer true, and I didn't even know I was doing it. I just knew how to make the discomfort go away, and that night, that's exactly what I did. I tucked it into the same drawer as the mailbox, the Cayman trip, the missing W-2, the flinch at the kitchen table, a drawer so full it should have rattled every time I closed it, and somehow, still, it never did. It was the spring of our 14th year of marriage when Mark sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where we used to balance our checkbook together in the early days, and told me Rootwise needed 1 more infusion. "I wouldn't ask, Claire. I swear to God I wouldn't ask, but we are this close." He held his thumb and forefinger a centimeter apart, the universal gesture of every man who has said this sentence and meant it falsely. "The Hendricks Group wants to acquire us, but they need to see 6 more months of stable runway before they'll close the deal. After that, Claire, after that, this is over. We're set. Eli's college, the house, all of it, done." I had $80,000 left of my grandmother's inheritance. The very last of it, sitting in a separate account that, by some instinct I still don't fully understand, I had never let him touch before. "I need it, Claire. I need all of it." I think some part of me, some small, persistent, unkillable part of me, finally woke up that night. Not enough to refuse him, not yet, but enough to ask one question I'd never asked before. "If Rootwise is about to be acquired by the Hendricks Group, for what you're telling me is a life-changing amount of money," I said slowly, "why do you need $80,000 from a dead woman's teaching pension to get there?" Mark's face did something I'd never seen it do before. It went very, very still. "Don't talk about your grandmother like that," he said. "I'm not talking about her like anything. I'm asking you a question." "It's complicated, Claire. Bridge financing during an acquisition is normal. It's not a referendum on the deal, it's just—" He stopped, started again. "Do you trust me or not?" And there it was. The question every liar eventually asks, because it's so much easier to make the conversation about your loyalty than about his honesty. I gave him the $80,000. I want to sit with that for a second, because I think it's the part of this story people will judge me for the most, and I understand why. I'd seen the cracks. I'd packed the suitcase with the sunglasses I didn't recognize. I'd heard about the condo from my own son. I had every reason to stop and look closely, and instead I handed over the very last of what my grandmother spent 30 years protecting for me, because some buried part of me still believed that doubting him meant failing him. 6 months later, almost to the week, I asked Mark for a divorce. Not because of the money. Not yet. I didn't know about the money, not really, not the full shape of it. I asked for a divorce because I had woken up one morning that September, looked at the man across from me at breakfast, a man I had built an entire architecture of excuses to live with, and realized I didn't recognize the structure of my own life anymore. Eli was about to leave for college. The house felt like a museum of a marriage that had quietly ended years before either of us said the word. I expected anger. I expected negotiation. I did not expect what Mark actually said, calm as a man discussing weather. Fine, but you should know there's nothing left, Claire. Rootwise barely covers payroll most months. I've got maybe $11,000 to my name. If anything, I'm going to need alimony from you. I sat across from him in the lawyer's office 3 weeks later and listened to him say it again, this time under penalty of perjury, on a sworn financial disclosure form. Total liquid assets, $11,420. I didn't know yet about Heritage Private Suites, or the offshore account, or the acquisition that had actually closed 2 years earlier, not 6 months in the future like he'd told me. I didn't know about the condo, or the life he'd built 4 miles from our house with money I had personally helped subsidize while believing I was saving us both. I just knew, looking at that number on the page, that something in my body had finally, quietly, stopped believing him. It would take a $14 subscription fee, a sharp-eyed junior paralegal, and one misdirected piece of mail to prove that my body had been right. My divorce attorney was a woman named Renata Cole, sharp-eyed and unhurried, the kind of lawyer who looked like she'd seen every version of every lie a husband could tell and had stopped being surprised by any of them years ago. She assigned a junior paralegal, a 24-year-old named Priya Anand, to comb through 3 years of joint financial records as part of standard discovery. It was Priya who found it. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice carrying the particular energy of someone who has found something and is trying very hard to sound professional about it. Mrs. Delacroix, I want to ask you about a recurring charge. $14.99 monthly, going back almost 6 years, on the joint account ending in 4471. It's labeled HPS Monthly Services. Does that mean anything to you? I almost said no. I almost let it go, the way I'd let 100 small confusions go before. But something in me, maybe my grandmother's voice, maybe just exhaustion with my own forgiving, made me pause. Heritage Private Suites, I said slowly. It's a mailbox. He told me it was for separating Rootwise's investor correspondence. It's still active, Priya said. The charge posted 3 days ago. Rootwise had been formally dissolved, on paper, 8 months prior, as part of what Mark called winding down operations ahead of the asset sale. I remember sitting very still in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, doing the math that any reasonable person would have done years earlier. If the company didn't exist anymore, what exactly was that mailbox still receiving? I didn't call Mark. I didn't call Renata, not yet either. I did something that surprised even me. I got in my car and drove to Heritage Private Suites myself. It was a sleek, almost clinical building in the kind of zip code where the parking valets wear earpieces. The young man behind the desk, a college kid named Tyler who clearly had no idea he was about to become a key witness in a divorce, was easy enough to charm. I explained, truthfully, that I was Mark Delacroix's wife, that we managed our mail jointly, and that I'd lost the spare key to box 214. People believe wives. That's the strange, sad mechanism that finally worked in my favor. The same trust that had let Mark hide behind me for years was the exact thing that let me walk into that building unquestioned. Tyler opened the box. Inside was a stack of unopened mail, 6 weeks deep, the kind of accumulated correspondence of a man who's gotten careless because he believes no one is looking. Most of it was junk. 2 envelopes were not. The first was from a wealth management firm I'd never heard of, addressed to M. Delacroix, Westgate Holdings, LLC. The second, the one that mattered, the one I am still, even now, slightly amazed found its way into that box at all, was a misdirected statement, clearly meant for a different client at the same firm, accidentally double-stuffed into Mark's envelope by some overworked mailroom clerk on what must have been an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday in their world. It was a quarterly summary for an account titled Westgate Founders Reserve, Offshore Holding, Cayman National Trust. Balance as of last quarter, $2,417,902.33. I stood in that lobby, holding a piece of paper that wasn't even technically addressed to me, and felt the entire architecture of my marriage collapse at once, all 15 years of it, like a building coming down in a controlled demolition, not violent, just suddenly, completely gone. I didn't confront Mark that day. I drove home, sat at my kitchen table, the same table, always the same table, and called Renata. "I think I found something," I said. "I think I found everything." What followed was 3 weeks of quiet, methodical investigation, the kind Renata's office specialized in. A forensic accountant named Walter Diggs was brought in, a soft-spoken man with the patience of a saint and the instincts of a bloodhound. What he uncovered, piece by piece, was a financial double life so complete it would have been impressive if it hadn't been built directly on top of my grandmother's life savings. Rootwise had been acquired by the Hendricks Group not 6 months in the future, as Mark told me the night he asked for my last $80,000, but 2 years and 3 months earlier than that conversation. The acquisition price, $9.2 million. Mark's personal share, after buyouts of his 2 co-founders, $4.1 million. Of that, he had moved $2.6 million into an offshore holding structure called Westgate Founders Reserve within 11 days of the deal closing. 11 days. While I was still depositing freelance checks into our joint account to help cover what he called a temporary cash crunch. He had used roughly $800,000 of his remaining funds to purchase, in cash, a 2-bedroom luxury condominium at the Marlowe Residences downtown. The building Eli's friend's father had mentioned in passing, 18 months before anyone believed him. The condo was held under Westgate Holdings, LLC, a shell entity formed 4 days after the acquisition closed, with Mark listed as sole managing member. The late nights at the office of the last 3 years of our marriage were, according to phone records and a doorman's sign-in log that Walter quietly subpoenaed, evenings spent at that condo, sometimes alone, sometimes. And this detail, I will admit, took my breath away in a different, colder way than the money had, with a woman named Vanessa Ruiz, a former Rootwise marketing contractor whose name I recognized only vaguely from a company holiday party 4 years earlier. I want to be honest with you about something. The money broke something practical in me. The discovery of Vanessa broke something else, something quieter and more personal, and I won't pretend the 2 injuries felt the same. But by the time Walter laid both of them out on Renata's conference table, side by side, I found I had very little feeling left for either. I had spent so many years protecting my capacity to forgive Mark that I think I simply ran out of it all at once, like a well finally going dry after being drawn from too long. The $80,000 from my grandmother's pension, the very last of it, given 6 months before I asked for the divorce, had gone, Walter discovered, directly into a renovation of the Marlowe condo. New countertops, a primary bathroom remodel, a $6,000 set of Italian light fixtures. My grandmother had spent 30 years as a public school teacher, clipping coupons and skipping vacations, to leave me something that would be mine alone, in my name alone, for whatever life required of me. Mark had used the last of it to buy light fixtures for the home he'd built with another woman, 4 miles from the house where our son grew up. Not her husband's, hers. I understood, finally, sitting in that conference room, exactly what my grandmother had been trying to protect me from. Not Mark's failure, his success. She had known, somehow, in the particular way that careful old women sometimes know things, that the danger was never going to be that he'd fail. It was that he'd succeed quietly, somewhere I couldn't see and never tell me. Renata didn't want to confront Mark right away. We let him keep lying, she told me, with the calm of a woman who has done this 100 times. Every lie he tells now under oath is one more thing we get to use later. Patience is the most expensive thing you can buy in a divorce, Claire, and you happen to have all of it you need. So we waited. We let the case proceed normally. We let Mark's lawyer, a slick, overconfident man named Desmond Hale, file motion after motion arguing for spousal support, citing his clients, severely diminished post-startup financial circumstances, and good faith efforts to rebuild from near-zero assets. 2 weeks before the final hearing, Mark was required to sign an updated sworn financial disclosure, standard procedure to confirm nothing material had changed. He sat across from his own lawyer, according to the deposition transcript I'd later read, and once again listed his liquid assets as approximately $14,000. He signed it, under penalty of perjury, knowing, somewhere underneath whatever part of him had learned to live this comfortably split in two, that a forensic accountant was sitting 11 floors above his lawyer's office, holding records of $2.4 million he thought no one would ever find. I think about that signature more than almost anything else in this story. Not the money, not even Vanessa. That signature, the casual, practiced ease of a man putting his name to a lie he'd told so many times it had become a kind of muscle memory for him, the same way my forgiveness had become muscle memory for me. We were, in the end, perfectly matched in our self-deceptions. The difference was that mine had only ever cost me. His had cost everyone but him. The final hearing took place on a gray Wednesday morning in March, in a courtroom that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and old coffee. Mark wore the navy suit he used to wear to investor pitches, the one I'd had tailored for him 11 years earlier as a birthday gift. Desmond Hale opened with the same arguments he'd been rehearsing for months: diminished assets, good faith hardship, a man trying to rebuild after the brutal collapse of his life's work. Judge Marlene Whitcomb, a woman in her early 60s with the patient, unhurried expression of someone who had heard every excuse a courtroom could produce, listened without much visible reaction. Then Renata stood. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to enter Exhibit 14 into evidence." She slid the offshore statement across the table, not to Mark, not yet, but to the judge first. I watched Judge Whitcomb's eyes move down the page. I watched the small, almost imperceptible lift of one eyebrow, the universal expression of a person doing arithmetic they did not expect to need to do that morning. "Mr. Hale," the judge said, "are you aware of an account titled Westgate Founders Reserve, held by your client through Westgate Holdings LLC?" I have never, before or since, seen a lawyer's face change that quickly. Desmond Hale looked at Mark. Mark looked at the table. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a recess to confer with my client." "You may have 10 minutes, Judge Whitcomb said. "I'd use them wisely." That was the moment, not the bank statement itself, that had already done its quiet work weeks earlier, in Renata's office, in my own chest. This was the moment the lie became public, official, undeniable, spoken into a room with a judge and a court reporter, and a small, stunned silence that Mark could no longer talk his way out of. When the recess ended, Desmond Hale stood and, in the flattened, careful voice of a man salvaging what little he could, withdrew the request for spousal support in light of newly disclosed financial information. Judge Whitcomb did not let it go that easily. "Mr. Delacroix signed a sworn financial disclosure 2 weeks ago," she said, looking directly at Mark for the first time, "listing total liquid assets of approximately $14,000. I'd like an explanation for the roughly $2.4 million discrepancy before I decide whether this matter needs to be referred for further review." Mark did not have an explanation, not one that survived contact with the room. By the end of that hearing, the financial settlement had shifted entirely. The court ordered a full and immediate accounting of all assets, including the Marlowe condo and the offshore account, both of which were determined to be marital property acquired during the marriage and therefore subject to equitable division. A division that, given the timing, the concealment, and the sworn false statements, the judge weighted heavily in my favor. Mark's perjured disclosure was referred to the district attorney's office for review, a process that, I would later learn, resulted in a deferred prosecution agreement contingent on full financial disclosure and restitution. I did not get revenge that day, not in the way people sometimes mean the word. I did not yell. I did not throw anything. I sat very still in a hard wooden chair and watched 15 years of careful lying come apart in under 20 minutes, undone not by my anger but by his own signature, his own greed, his own quiet certainty that no one was ever going to check. It has been a little over 2 years since that hearing. Eli is a junior in college now, studying environmental engineering, a field he says he chose because he likes problems that actually have correct answers. A sentence that, when he first said it to me over the phone, made me laugh harder than I had in months, for reasons I think he understood better than he let on. I used the settlement, along with what remained of my own freelance earnings, to start a small marketing consultancy of my own, something I'd always wanted to do but had quietly shelved for years under the weight of we can't afford the risk right now. It turns out we could afford it. I just hadn't been the one holding the money. I bought a house, modest, 2 bedrooms, a garden I am slowly, badly, happily learning to keep alive. I put my grandmother's photograph on the mantle, the one of her in front of the schoolhouse where she taught for 3 decades, and some mornings I talk to it, quietly over coffee, the way you talk to someone whose advice you finally understand. Not her husband's, hers. Mark and I are not close. We are civil, for Eli's sake, in the particular careful way of 2 people who used to know each other completely and now only know how to be polite. He moved out of state 18 months ago. I heard, through the kind of grapevine that exists in every small professional community, that the relationship with Vanessa did not survive the divorce, though I find I genuinely don't have feelings about that one way or the other anymore. That particular wound healed strangely fast, once the bigger one took all the attention. People sometimes ask me if I'm angry. I think they expect me to say yes, and for a long time I think I would have, but the truth is more complicated than anger. What I feel mostly, when I think about those 15 years, is something closer to clarity. The specific, hard-won clarity of someone who spent a decade and a half building elaborate, loving explanations for things that never actually needed explaining, because the truth was simply unkind, and I wasn't ready yet to let it be. I think about my grandmother often, about the will she left, the $400,000 she spent 30 years protecting, and the single line she added almost as an afterthought, except it wasn't an afterthought at all. It was the only piece of advice she gave me that I didn't take in time, and the only one in the end that turned out to matter most. If there is one thing I would tell another woman sitting across the table from a man insisting there's nothing left, it's this: the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's often just evidence that no one has looked hard enough yet. It took a $14 subscription fee, an unopened envelope meant for someone else, and a sharp young paralegal who didn't let a small, strange number slide past her, to undo 15 years of careful, expensive lying. The truth, in my experience, rarely announces itself with thunder. More often, it waits quietly in a mailbox, in a recurring charge nobody bothered to question, in the small, dull paperwork of an ordinary Tuesday, patient, persistent, and eventually, impossible to ignore. My grandmother knew that. She always did. She just gave me a will to remember it by, and it took me 15 years to finally read what she meant.